on to sort of cultural learning, and that they teach us, they're odd, but they teach us something important about our relationship with consciousness, I think. All right. So let me begin with our rock star. This is Joan of Arc, the patron saint of France, in the act of hearing God or her angels speak. So the experience of being of voice is being spoken to in the absence of a human speaker. These experiences are really important in religion because when a spirit is invisible, the best first person evidence of God is that God speaks. That's how you know that God is there. So here, Gabriel is speaking to Mary. Yahweh spoke to Abraham. Uh, Jesus spoke to his disciples after his death. The angel Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. But they're also deeply human experiences, the experiences that happen to people, and sometimes they really matter. So Augustine is a famous example. A voice converted Augustine. He wanted to become a Christian. He struggled with his conversion because of what he assumed the conversion asked of him. And one afternoon he was overwhelmed. He still couldn't convert. Somebody visited him. He was overwhelmed by the story. He ran into the garden, threw himself at the foot of the fig tree, heard a voice, and that voice led him to his conversion, and that had a profound effect on Christianity. A more recent example, closer to home, Martin Luther King Jr., in the beginning of the civil rights movement, during the Montgomery bus boycotts, King had death threats against him and his family. He was uncertain about whether to continue, and he sat at his kitchen table and prayed, and he said that he heard God say that he would be with him, and he chose to go forward. This next one is a woman that I know who, kind of an ordinary person, graduated from a decent college, and the best job she could get was the morning shift at the local kind of small grocery store, and it made her very grumpy. And she said, one morning this woman came in and she looked like she'd been up all night. She looked like it had been rough. She threw her stuff on the counter, 2 6-packs of Miller Lite, some cat food, and a food product of some sort, donuts, I think. She looked at me and she said, "Hey, can you get me a carton of cigarettes?" And I'm thinking, excellent. This is what I want to be doing with my life. So I turned around, I rolled my eyes, and I started thinking my judgmental thoughts. In that moment, I literally heard the voice of God say to me, "Do not judge this woman. I've created her in my image and I love her." And poor woman, I almost fell over. I'm like trying to give her change, and I'm like, whoa, the voice of God spoke to me. I've been changed ever since. So that the proximate, however we understand the ultimate source of these experiences, the proximate cause is some kind of thought or mental event that comes to feel as if it is not one's own thought and doesn't come from inside. I mean, that gets messy, but many voices feel as if they have an external source, and it's hard to know how you would think about what they were except as some kind of mental event that became misattributed, to use a more cognitive sciencey language. They're more common in the general population than you think. If you stick to audible voices, although there's a complicated story there, if you stick to audible voices, a voice you can hear with your ears, you get a rate of, 3 to 10% in standard surveys. About 1 in 3 charismatic Christians will say they've heard God speak in a way that had a hearing quality. And if you give people details and examples and you say, "Has that ever happened to you?" you get a much higher rate. But we associate with these experiences with psychiatric illness, and particularly with schizophrenia, in which the voices are the most characteristic symptom. And these voices are more frequent, more physical, more substantial, and more mean than the kinds of experiences people report in the religious context, but it's still the same, recognizably the same phenomenon. So some people have argued that all of these experiences, the Martin Luther King Jr., the Joan of Arc, Augustine, the schizophrenia, they all come from a continuum of psychosis. And what has happened is that the core of the experience of the psychosis is that there's a deficit that causes the thought to lose its quality of what William James calls its minus. And so a person with schizophrenia has a dollop of that uh, deficit, and Martin Luther King Jr. has a kind of drop. That is not my intuition. My argument is that there's something more fundamental about our relationship with our minds, and that psychosis is a special sort of condition that tweaks something much more basic. I began paying attention to odd experiences in the late 1980s. I was studying people that you might call spiritual but not religious, in the form we call modern magic or witchcraft. And I thought I was there to study belief. So I was kind of thinking of myself in the grand tradition of Evans Pritchard, except these were people who were practicing magic, but they'd heard about science. They lived in a very modern world. And the question was, how could apparently reasonable people believe in apparently unreasonable beliefs? But what I saw pretty early on is that what mattered to people, or something that mattered a lot to people, is that they had vivid, powerful experiences of spirit, and that these experiences, these vivid experiences, had something to do with learning. So that people would say to me, "You want to understand magic? You've got to practice the magic. You've got to do the magic. And here are the courses that you take that teach you how to do the magic. And this is how we'll initiate you, and you'll learn how to do these rituals. And then you'll feel the magical force." And they said that some people are going to be better than other people, but everybody who practices is going to feel something. So that's been sort of the rabbit that I've been chasing for a few decades now. What kinds of odd experiences people have, and why. And I've been working in these two pathways, the anthropology of religion and then psychiatric anthropology. And I've been increasingly adding psychological methods to my open-ended, fieldwork-driven, semi-structured interviews. It's nevertheless, the core of what I do is what I call comparative phenomenology. I think of this as in the tradition of William James. I sit, I listen, I start by just asking people to tell me their story, but I probe in the way that a clinician would probe, without presuming illness. Tell me more. And would you say you heard it with your ears? Would you say that you felt that touch on your shoulder? Was it like a real touch? And then, but again, I've been combining that method with surveys and experimental work. Over the last few decades, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, some of them psychotic and some of them not, about their voices. And I'm going to try to build a case this morning for a non-mad pathway. And I'm going to make a case for three causal factors. The first is that I think training really does matter. I'm going to tell that story through talking about my work with evangelical Christians. Sometimes, some years after I wrote that book on modern magic, I met a young, blonde California evangelical who told me that if I wanted to understand her God, I should sit down and have a cup of coffee with him. So that captured my attention. And so I spent years in these churches where people expect to experience God kind of as if he's a person among people. And they certainly expect to have an experience of God that feels like some kind of back and forth relationship. And I saw that a new evangelical would arrive in this church and sort of learn that that woman, that person had to imagine that the mind wasn't private, but that thoughts and images and sensations you might have understood as self-generated are actually God speaking. So they have to learn to have to think differently about their mind. And so I'll give you an example of how they do this. Here's a woman who said to me, well, and she's explaining this, and she says, when people were praying over me and I'm just receiving it, and all of a sudden I hear, go to Kansas, which is where her parents lived then, because I was debating whether to go to Kansas, but I hadn't been thinking about it within a 24-hour period. And so the church teaches people to look for certain kinds of thoughts. And people will say that as they look for these kinds of thoughts, thoughts that are spontaneous, thoughts that are kind of like the thing that God would say, those thoughts start to stand out more to them. A new person in this church learns to practice talking with God, and that often looks like this. The person is, in a sense, by herself, but often with other people. She's got her eyes closed. She's doing something in her mind. And what she's doing is really two things. You could describe this differently, but on the one hand, she's doing mental imagery cultivation. So people have told me about, praying to God, and they they want to feel God's arm around their shoulders, or they're going for a walk with God and they're listening for what God would say, or they're kind of thinking about God and they're feeling what it would feel like to be in God's throne room. So they're having these they're seeking these imaginative experiences, and they're often wanting to feel the power of God on their cheek, or the touch of God on their shoulder, or the sound of God's voice. They're also just talking to God as if God is there, is something that the pastors will say. You don't believe it? Just talk to him as if he's there. Put down a cup of coffee, a real cup of coffee for God, and just talk to him as if he's sitting there with his coffee. And people will come into the church and say, like, God doesn't talk to me. And after a few months, they will say something like, I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. There are hundreds of books that will teach you how to do this. These books typically say things like this, that God's voice normally sounds like a flow of spontaneous thoughts rather than an audible voice. But it's clear that sometimes it is audible. So here's somebody who said to me, the Lord spoke to me clearly in April, like May or April, to start a school. And I'm curious about this. And I say, you heard this audibly? Yeah. Were you alone? Yeah, I was just praying. Wasn't praying anything really, just thinking about God. And I heard start a school. I immediately got up and it was like, okay, Lord, where? And we recently published a new version of this work in cognitive science, in which we were able to show that in two large projects, actually the minutes you pray per day predicts whether people experience voices and other vivid spiritual experiences. This shift and in some inner experiences feeling as if they are more vivid and feeling as if they're a little outside you and maybe not even your own, you can see this effect without God. So this is a tulpa. I've been spending time recently in a corner of in the corner of the internet that has at least 30,000 people. And the tulpa is the name for the invisible friend that the human wants to create. And the tulpamancer is the name for the human. And these people use exactly the same techniques as the Christians. They do mental imagery cultivation. So they have an image of what they want their invisible friend to be like. I should say they start with no metaphysical commitments. This is not meant to be supernatural. This is meant to be just a cool technique that you can use. So they start with an image in their mind, and they really try to see it and feel it and touch it and hear it as vividly as they possibly can. One of the guides talks about 10,000 hours of mental imagery cultivation. The other technique is just to talk to the tulpa as if it's there. And over time, somewhere between 1 and 6 months, people say that they develop a series, they just develop a distinct sense that an invisible being is present and that this being responds. They often have sort of notches of increased realness, but they really develop a sense that there is a sentient being who interacts with them. And then that creates all sorts of metaphysical challenges because they don't believe this is real, but now it does feel real. And then, like, what do you do about that? Here's the second factor, absorption, that indeed some people are better than others, or you can show some evidence that this appears to be the case. So the absorption scale was developed by Auke, Tellegen, and Atkinson back in 74. It was initially developed as a measure of hypnotizability, although it's got relatively low but significant relationship with the gold standard of hypnotizability. There are 34 items. You look at them, you say, this statement is true or false for me. And it's sort of invitational. People have tried to factor analyze it in a number of ways. One of the things that we see very clearly is that it predicts, or the more truths people attest to in the absorption scale, the more they say, sometimes I experience things as I did as a child, or I can change noise into music by the way that I listen to it, the more they have vivid spiritual experiences and vivid supernatural experiences, even if they're not religious. And Kara Weissman, one of my collaborators, and I recently published a paper in which one of the things that Kara was doing was looking at a large sample of people. And we have made an argument that there are two factors in the scale, although it's not super clear, but we think it's true. And that one of those factors has something to do with mental imagery and interest in inner sensory experience. And the other has to do with some kind of willingness to immerse yourself before worrying whether something's true, to suspend disbelief, to sink into the experience. The third factor is that the way that you think about thought matters. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to unspool this. I think that humans everywhere have more or less a default model of how thought works. That thought is inside us, it's private, nobody sees what we think. They are our thoughts, they have this William James quality of mindness. And the thoughts don't kind of leak out of our mind to act on their own in the world. But all humans have experiences that violate the basic default model. So we dream. Some of those dreams feel pretty powerful and they feel like they convey information from the outside. Sometimes when you're really angry at somebody and they're not present and you curse them, it feels like you're doing something, like it's an action. Sometimes it feels like love is just bigger than you are, that it's kind of leaving you and acting. So I think you can make the argument that there are different cultural ideas about things like cursing and prayer and being inspired, hearing the muses, the power of witchcraft. I think these are cultural practices that elaborate these conflicting intuitions in different ways. And they're all and at the core of these like non-default intuitions is the idea that thoughts can leave the mind and act in the world, or that the thought is vulnerable to the thoughts of others which can enter the mind in non-ordinary ways. These are around the ideas that thought is somehow potent. And we talk about this as porosity, the idea that the mind-world boundary is permeable in non-ordinary ways. So in a few years ago, I ran the Mind and Spirit Project, and we were interested in the relationship between the different ideas people had about thinking, not their experience, not, the mechanism of thought, but how people represented, imagined, understood the act of thinking and their vivid experiences of gods and spirits. And then this is the team. We worked in 5 parts of the world. And as a team, we did 3 things. We had open-ended, vivid, open-ended, long, engaged conversations with people of deep faith, half of them charismatic Christians in each of these places, and half of them the local faith. We trained research assistants to stand online at something like, an insurance agency or the Department of Motor Vehicles, asked people these questions in short, truncated, face-to-face ways. And we gave undergraduates surveys, undergraduates being familiar with that weird task of taking an exam. In this work, we asked people about porosity, and we had stories. So there were stories like this. Suppose in a distant community, that's like this one, there's a woman named Martha. One day, Martha realizes that Mary's really angry at her, and she's been angry for a long time. And in the field work, in the open-ended ethnographic interviews, people would probe and probe. So do you think Mary can hurt Martha just by thinking about her, even if Martha's not there? Supposing Mary's a special sort of person, supposing she's got special training, supposing she uses special words. Do you think that could happen? When do you think that could happen? And then we also turned this into a survey. We also created a porosity scale in which we asked about, these are the items were like these. Spirits can use thoughts and feelings to hurt people, so spirits here are the intermediary, but the thoughts are doing the action. Evil thoughts can go directly out into the world like a Wi-Fi or a radio and cause bad things to happen to people without a spirit's help. And what we found was quite striking. No matter where we went, no matter how we asked the question, the more absorption somebody reported, the more voices and other vivid experiences they had, and absorption behaved in our data more like an individual measure. The more porosity they had, the more voices and vivid experiences they had. And porosity behaved a little bit more like a social, like a cultural measure. We published that in PNAS. We did a follow-up that came out, I think it's just come out. And in this, we looked at 2,000 people on prolific. We replicated our original PNAS findings, again, made a reasonable argument for there being 2 underlying factors to absorption, but we also had the opportunity to look a little bit more deeply at porosity. First thing we saw is that, and really Kara Weissman led this work. The first thing we saw is that porosity never becomes the default model. It's people, only a few participants endorse all the porosity scale items. It doesn't happen as the modal response in at least 50% of our items. At the same time, porosity is broadly accessible. So it's also quite true that like in this new US prolific, pretty reasonably well-educated, pretty secular data set, only a third of the participants reject all of the items, and many, many, many endorse at least one of our porosity measures. And the other thing is that the nature of the porosity varies across cultural and religious settings. So the people who are spiritual but not religious are more likely to affirm things like, if somebody is sick, thinking good thoughts can still help them get better. And the Christians are the ones who are more likely to affirm the power of spirits and the power of prayer. So there's some story in which, okay, we've got this very seems to be pretty robust finding that there's a relationship between porosity and spiritual presence events, voices, visions, kind of sense of presence. It's not the default model, but it's really, many people say yes to at least some of the items, and it's culturally variable. And that's kind of interesting. And so we create this model in which we observe that a person is more likely to hear God speak if they have the epistemic some flexibility, cultural support, and cultivated skills to shift temporarily away from a mundane model of mind into a more porous way of thinking and being, and the capacity to immerse themselves fully into this experience of porosity. So we think these three factors work together. So to summarize, there are three factors: practice, proclivity, porosity. All three of them facilitate the experience of thought as not one's own and not inside. And they seem to work together in a way that sort of makes sense. So I think there's some kind of support for a non-mad pathway in which attention to inner mental events leads to some of those events seeming to be more external and more in the world real. So I'm going to take a final 15 minutes and talk about psychosis. And I'm going to try to make 2 points. And if I run out of time, there it is. The first is that content and valence for persons with psychosis hearing voices, that shifts across cultural borders. And then sometimes there may be people who become religious experts who could be vulnerable to psychosis, whose practices seem as if they may change the experience of their psychosis. So let's first talk about valence and content. This is the first of a number of papers that I did in which I and colleagues looked at 20 people in the US, San Mateo, in Chennai, in South India, and Accra, West Africa. We asked people, these were all people diagnosed with schizophrenia according to the same standards, half male, half female. And we sit and we talked with them and asked them many questions, but among them, do you know who's talking? Have you met who's talking in the flesh? Do you like them? What do they tell you to do? And the first thing to say is that these people are all recognizably ill. This is not a happy story about how if you develop schizophrenia, you should move to Ghana. That's not the point of the story. San Mateo. To these Americans, these 20 Americans, hearing a voice means that you're crazy. Very, very clear. Almost all of them used a diagnostic label to describe. They just spontaneously, in the conversations with me, they generate a diagnostic label even when I don't produce it. This is my favorite response to my question of like, tell me your story. What's going on? Somebody said, I went into the hospital with a little depression and I must have caught all that other stuff on the way out. For these Americans, the voices are often unknown. They don't know who is speaking. And for these Americans, this is the most striking observation. The voices are very often violent. It's like torturing people to take their eyes out with a fork, cut somebody's head and drink their blood. Really nasty stuff. In this first sample of 20 people, not one of them said that their dominant voice hearing experience was positive. In Chennai, and I should say I've done more interviews than this represents. I think there's something really here. In Chennai, over half the sample hears their kin. These are mostly people they know or have known. Kin scold. The commands here are experienced as go to the kitchen, cook food, don't smoke, don't drink. There are many more positive voices. So about a third of the sample, a little more, had significant positive experiences. One person, after telling me how annoying her mother was, then said, "But she's my mother. I like my mother's voice. I want her to keep talking." The negative experiences here um, are far more often than in the US, sexually shaming. So somebody who hears voices will experience the voice telling other people in the room that they masturbate and everybody knows it. People talked about being embarrassed that their voice saw them undress or their voice saw them have sex. This theme is much more striking than in the American sample. Although Americans also, our 20 people, also many of them reported sexual experiences, but the shame and the negativity was more striking in the Chennai sample, and that's where that was reported. In Accra, um, there are more known voices than in the American sample, but the striking thing is that half or more people had dominant positive voices, mostly of God. And it was quite striking to me. I just actually spent some time in another hospital in Cape Coast, 3 hours to the west, found something pretty similar. People are minimizing their negative voices. They don't want to admit to them. And they're elaborating their positive voices. And they say things like, God tells me to do the right thing. If I hadn't had God, I would have been dead long ago. So there's some basic story in these interviews in which I want to say that there are ideas about the mind that might be reflected in the content and even the valence of these voices. In the US, arguably a more violent place to begin with, the mind is a private possession. And I think people experience voices as a violation of their private space. In Chennai, there's a lot of cultural invitation to make the social experience central in your understanding of how thought works. People experience voices as kin. In Accra, there are lots of ideas about potent thought in the form of witchcraft. And these voices are tend to be interpreted as some kind of supernatural war, and the big voices are there to protect people from supernatural attack. And I want to tell some story about what I'll call kindling, that when people fall ill, I think they have a wash of auditory and quasi-auditory experiences, some of them good, some of them not so good, some of them murmuring, some of them probably auditory, but you're not quite sure what's going on. And I think there's a story of selective attention shaped by culture in which people are identifying what they're experiencing and elaborating and shaping those experiences into particular forms. Let me, uh, um, okay, let me take, I'm going to sacrifice part of the talk. Let me quickly tell you about other places. Student went to Kazan and Russia. Um, these 27 people, much more folkloric, much more stories of creatures and animals. They have lots of commands. They tell them to do household work. Shanghai, Emily Ng. Um, these voices are full of politics. So people hear Mao, they hear Chiang Kai-shek, they hear party operatives. I mean, it's really quite striking. I think this was over half the sample. Chiang Mai, this is a paper we're just publishing, done with Julia Casanidi. What was really striking in in these voices, 20 people, psychiatric hospital, this is a culture where people are really interested in mindfulness and managing the mind. And so people often attribute their troubles to insufficient mindfulness, and they experience their voices. There's a lot of talk about wildness, about things in the forest that are out of control and are wild and are sort of unmanageable. And then this they attribute it to their mindfulness. The big obvious take-home point here: US patients report many more violent commands. I think that's important. I take 5 minutes, 3 minutes to say that there's also a story to tell about experts. So I spent some time in Ghana with these religious experts who are called okomfu, who have interactions with gods. And they hear the god's voice. This is the altar is one place through which they engage with the gods. What happens is that somebody will be called by the gods in their late teens, often at a time when people are falling ill with their first psychotic episode. The person will be called, and because it is part of the cultural expectation that the person will look as if they're crazy. And if they're taken for training, they go for 1 or 2 year training in which they're taught to listen to the gods more clearly, to identify who is a helping god and who are the demons, and how to ignore the god. And when they finish, they're supposed to have a reasonable relationship with the gods. And if they don't accept the call, they go crazy. So let me just tell you what I saw, which is that our team interviewed a bunch of these people, and I went back and I talked to the frequent voice hearers. And what I saw, and I played them a track that represents the experience of hearing distressing voices that we translated into Fante. And what I saw, I mean, people are enormously complicated, but I saw at least two groups of people. There were people who seemed to think that being in a kung fu was cool to do. Maybe their mom was in a kung fu. They wanted to do it. They became in a kung fu. I didn't think that their story of being called by the gods was particularly impressive. In other words, it didn't really sound psychotic as they told the story. And when I played them the track, they were like, what the dickens is that? This is not something I recognize. There are other people who, when they talked about being called by the gods, it really sounded that they were psychiatrically ill. An aunt had said, take him to a psychiatric hospital. And the mom had said, no, 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 I'm taking him for training. Those people were were more likely to talk about ongoing auditory experience. The experience was pretty frequent. They still heard demons. And when I played the track for them, they said, oh my goodness, that's what the gods sound like. All of these people say that the practice changes their experience. And when I did some interviewing with people who talk to the dead, psychics or spirit mediums, I saw the same kind of story about at least two different kinds of people. So I think that there's room for the possibility that these practices change the experience of some people who are vulnerable to psychosis. So let me end here with a broader point. So I want to suggest that it's at least possible to learn to experience some thoughts as not me and as not inside, and that if humans do so with the intent of experiencing an invisible others, humans can make that invisible other feel real. And I'm not opposed to the possibility that there are non-human elements involved in this process, that God could be there. But what I want to say clearly is that we have a relationship with our own minds, and we can use that relationship to make it feel as if an invisible other is present. And I just want to pause and say how remarkable that is. The most moving thing I saw in evangelical Christianity was that the God who spoke back felt like a social relationship to his humans. I'm not meaning to suggest that religion is always helpful or always a good thing in society. But for these people, it was their God made them feel loved and protected. And I'm sure that this is one reason for the striking finding that religious observance is good for your body's health. And so, actually, rather than just a sign of madness, voices are also evidence of the human capacity to heal ourselves from within. So let me end it there. If it's okay, I'll stop sharing so I can see you. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. Now for a question. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I've got to admit, this is one of the most fascinating talks I've heard in years, honestly. I really appreciate the amount of work you put into the research, and this also relates to my question. I'm wondering if you think, or if you have data on how in psychotics so schizophrenics, I think you mentioned at the end, how in them the type of the voice they hear correlates not just to social beliefs in their society on the mind, but on other topics as well. So morality was a big thing that I thought of when it comes to shame in sexual shame context, but also in terms of like how accepted violence is maybe in media portrayals, things like that, right? Did you investigate this at all? Thank you.
So, you know, when working with folks with psychosis, it's I distrust efforts to use large data sets and to correlate, because these interviews are kind of particularly with folks who are in the hospital. I mean, people can talk, but they talk in their own way. And so I'll go into an interview and I'll sort of really want to get out, an answer to the question of how many positive experiences, what kinds of positive experiences are there? What do you hear in your commands? And it's pretty clear that people say a bunch of things that they feel comfortable saying, and there are a lot of things they don't feel saying. So I haven't done any larger scale systematic comparisons, but I do think that all kinds of things that matter. I think there's a story about the social world. I think there's a story about the family experience. Okay, the doggies are going to camp, and we may be interrupted in a moment, but I will come back. The they are the family experience. So many people think, some people think that the way the voice is treated when the person first reports it changes the person's experience of the voice. And it's messy. You'll see an example of this in Eleanor Longden's excellent TED Talk. She says that she was hearing voices when she arrived in college. She was stressed out. She heard voices. They were neutral voices. She told a friend about her voices. The friend was horrified. And then she made her go to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist was bored by her, she said, until she mentioned voices, and then he kind of sat up and took notes. And then the voices became mean. And so some people want to say that the voices become mean when there is social stigma and a moral judgment about the voices. It's it's pretty easy to give a counter argument. So it could be the case that only some people, it's only when in the disease trajectory for some people, the voices will turn bad. That is a common illness feature. So it could be that that's going to happen anyway in the course of the disease. But anyway, the question that you're asking, I think, is really important. There's a social story, there's a family story, there's the way that people are reacting when they first have the voices recognized. Probably all of those play a role.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Interesting. And I agree that it's one of the ways of the mind for coping with illness. In psychoanalytic theories, there are several works that mention these voices or these psychotic trance that it helps. For example, when the patients cannot handle something inside their mind, they try to put it outside, so it's much more manageable. However, it can cause a feeling of non-responsibility. Like, for example, the assassin of John Lennon says, I just listened the instructions of someone telling me to do that to art by to himself. It was not me, it was something else. And I think also there is a degree of psychosis, like some of them also for healing, as you said, if there is a very traumatic event in the life of someone, the mind tries to separate itself from the experience, the real experience, and then learns to be separated because it's much more manageable and pleasurable to be like something else, like returning from reality. So my question is, in these cases that you have been studying in several places, do you have a story of what happened to these people? There was some crisis that detonated this psychosis or hearing voices?
Hold on a second. The handler for the puppies has arrived. Hold on. Richard, puppies are here.
Sorry, these are my children. They made another background, but your microphone is not working, Mudar.
I think we might have to repeat the question a bit closer to the microphone.
Now, is it working now?
I think it's just very far away. Maybe
Yeah, it was a bit muffled. Can you summarize it for me?
sorry.
Could you please
May I maybe just rephrase the question in a okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so just my question was, sometimes this psychosis is derived from an event that was, for example, a big crisis, someone that makes something so difficult to cope with that is there to be separated in body and mind from this event. So the question is, do you have, in this study, you have been trying on the data about the people if they have some sort of crisis or something that detonated these kind of events?
It's still a little muffled. Could somebody summarize that for me?
Um,
Olivia, could you summarize? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's our apologies. I think the question is whether you have the data on the people who you interviewed with psychosis and so on about experiences, whether there were crises or anything that happened that sort of detonated and led to the to hearing the voices and so on. Is it?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And it's I don't have that data for the people that I interviewed people, and it's a complicated question because people will often sort of generate a moment of crisis. So people, with sometimes people are able to pinpoint the first time that the experience happened. And sometimes for Americans, that's often terrifying. But it's not terrifying for everybody. Sometimes it feels like a something kind of cool, or is there it's a spiritual calling. It's certainly true. I think we know from the epidemiological data that when people are that stress and crisis is more likely to lead to a psychotic experience. But many things are more likely to lead to a psychotic experience. It's clear that if you are, sexually abused or emotionally abused, you're more likely to develop psychosis, but also, all kinds of other medical problems. And some people develop psychosis in the midst of a happy, healthy family. So Ellen Sacks's biography, The Center Cannot Hold, is really brilliant and wonderful, and an example of somebody who grew up in what she experienced as a happy, well-to-do home and developed these experiences.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very inspiring. I'm interested, what do you think about the impact of therapy on these voices?
Oh,
So
yeah.
as I understood, all patients were in the clinical settings, so probably they undergo a therapy and medical and so on. So I would be interested, what do you think? Is it possible that, for instance, the violence they mentioned in some cultures and less violence in other, so can it be somehow changed or affected by therapy, or it is something more constant, and also in longitudinal perspective, it will remain the same also in the clinical settings? Thank you so much.
It's a great question. More and more people are beginning to explore the role of therapy and helping people to manage the content and the emotional tone or the valence of their voices. And so there are a bunch of new non-pharmaceutical interventions like CBT, mindfulness training, the Hearing Voices group, compassion and acceptance, avatar therapy. And so these are all techniques that ask people to interact in some way with their voices. And this is a radical new approach because until relatively recently, many clinicians treated the voices as unreal symptoms that were unreal, and you should really ignore them. It is true that some of those moving memoirs, like Ellen Sacks or Nev Jones, they describe a therapist early on in the process to whom they could talk about their voices, and they found that really helpful. So there are really two therapeutic interventions. One, what's going on, and what's the meaning of these experiences to me? And the other is different approaches in teaching people to treat their voices as if they are in a social relationship and seeking to help that person create a useful social relationship with their voice. I should say these techniques don't work for everybody. There are people for whom nothing seems to work. But there are many people who, clearly the course of this illness is much more varied than we imagined 20 years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well. Wonderful presentation. From the cognitive science perspective, it seems like you are really pointing out that in the end, it's the inner voice is constructed social entity kind of that we start separating from our own selves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree to this, basically? And in the schizophrenic level, it's basically more fundamentally detached and fully uncontrollable, so to say, right? You could say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there are ways in which inner voices can come to feel as if they are not me and not inside, and inner experiences, images, stories. And I do think there's a special kind of tweaking in schizophrenia. One of my colleagues, Phil Corlett, talks about some kind of extra neural explosions in the insula. And he's trying to make an argument for that.
And then if that's the case, so basically from this perspective, how would you recommend to people or society in general to make sure that these voices are good voices and are soothing us? And is religion the right way to foster this actually, or is there a more fundamental thing
What
to
a
that?
great question. So I do think that the tulpamancers are onto something. And I'm about to explore spiritual but religious people who, are searching for a God without God and looking at what they do and how they do it and whether it works for them. But it is really creating, what I saw with the evangelicals is they are creating a kind of inner coach. It's helpful when you're creating this inner voice to have a community that shares an understanding and supports your understanding of how your sense of how this inner coach is supposed to work. I mean, the tulpamancers are really part of a quite active community. The tulpas are online with each other all the time, talking back and forth about what happens. Evangelicals are talking back and forth about how God is, and they're sort of correcting each other's God. And you could argue that therapy is a way of creating a kind of inner voice. I don't know if whether people who have been in therapy have ever had the sense of a talking head that accompanies them and interacts with them, gives them advice. And therapy is sort of like a process in which you have a lot of interaction in person, but then there's a lot of creation of interaction with this other person outside of the sessions, which looks a little bit like tulpamancy, evangelical Christianity. But it takes some work to make sure that these inner voices are good rather than mean.
Thank you so much. I think one last question.
Thank you. Yeah, good that you brought up tulpas because I also wanted to ask whether you already have some data. I too stumbled upon this internet community many years ago and say because it was completely fascinating. And what I actually find also quite the tulpamancers bring it a bit farther than the evangelical Christians. I also had to think of the evangelical Christians also really remind me of what the tulpamancers are doing. But they bring it a step further and really externalize this thing that they're creating to the point where they can see it next to them. And then to the point even where this other person can supposedly take over their body, right? And then switch between these entities so that they create what sounds to me a bit more like a dissociative identity disorder, but in a positive way. Yeah. I wonder if you can already share something about that.
Yeah, so I was contacted by a tulpamancer who read my book, When God Talks Back, and said, "Oh, we do this too. We just don't call it God." And so a young postdoctoral fellow, neuroscientist called Michael Lifshitz, came out with me to work with me at Stanford, and we generated some money, and we then started systematically flying in, I guess we talked to about 25 tulpamancers. And we had a sort of a gatekeeper in the tulpamancy community who basically helped us to identify people who were members in good standing in the community. And so anyway, we flew in these 25 people, and they kind of flew across the country and ended up at my door for lunch. And we talked to them for 4 hours, and then Michael took them off. And I mean, we talked to them. We gave them a set of questionnaires, and Michael took them off and put them into an fMRI machine. And they'd already agreed to do this task. And we had their tulpamancers, where they had the human complete some like sentence completion tasks, and the tulpa complete the tasks, and like a mom, a friend you imagine or somebody you imagine complete the tasks. So in this work, we find a shift in this scanning work. My understanding is that we weren't able to detect significant difference between tasks for some of those tasks when the tulpa was just speaking in the mind, but when the tulpa possessed the hand and used the hand to answer to write the word, we were able to see differences. I think in the supplemental motor cortex. It's we're still working on the results, but we were able to see some changes. It is, I think, likely that the kinds of pattern of dissociated motor activity that you find with hypnosis and dissociative identity disorder probably is in the same domain as the tulpa's experience. But of course, those are caused by very different kinds of things.
Okay, thank you very much. This is all that we have time for. So we'd like to thank you once again for your time.
Thank you for accepting our invitation
Yes.
to
Thank you.
Symposium, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was really a lovely conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye. You too.